James O'Connell was an ordinary man. He lived in Cedarville, a small town where nothing much ever happened. Cedarville was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's name, and the biggest excitement was the annual fall fair. The residents of Cedarville liked their routines, their peaceful lives. James was no exception. Every morning, like clockwork, he walked the same route to his favorite coffee shop. He greeted the same people along the way with polite nods. Mrs. Thompson with her ever-present poodle, Mr. Matthews on his morning jog, and the high school kids rushing to catch the bus. James had never been the kind of man who sought out adventure or even paid much attention to the more dramatic parts of life. He had a good job as an accountant at a local firm, a modest house he inherited from his parents, and a life that could be described as predictable, if not a little boring. His friends joked that James was the most dependable person they knew. Steady, reliable, a creature of habit. He never made waves, never strayed from his path, and certainly never got involved in anyone else's problems. But on that particular morning, as James sipped his coffee and skimmed through the news on his phone, something unusual caught his eye. At the table in the corner sat a man James didn't recognize, which was strange enough in a town like Cedarville. The man looked nervous, glancing around as if he were waiting for someone, or avoiding someone. He kept checking his watch, his leg bouncing up and down with an anxious energy. James, ever the observer, noticed but didn't think much of it. Maybe the guy was having a bad day, or maybe he was just passing through town. Cedarville occasionally had visitors, though they were mostly people stopping for gas on their way to somewhere more important. Still, something about this man didn't sit right with James, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. James finished his coffee and left the shop, pushing the strange man out of his mind. He had a full day ahead, and like every day, it would start with his walk through the park on his way to the office. The park was one of Cedarville's few claims to beauty, a sprawling green space with benches, old oak trees, and a small pond that reflected the morning light in a way that never failed to calm James. As he strolled through, he thought about his upcoming projects at work. Tax season was approaching, and though it meant long hours, James didn't mind. The predictable nature of his job was something he appreciated. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't change on a whim. They made sense in a way that life sometimes didn't. As he passed by the pond, lost in thought, something jolted him back to reality. A loud screech, the sound of tires skidding on asphalt, followed by a heavy thud. It all happened so fast that it took James a moment to realize what had just occurred. He turned toward the sound and saw a car had veered off the road, crashing into a tree on the edge of the park. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. James stood frozen, staring at the wreckage. A few people who had been walking in the park also stopped, unsure of what to do. His first instinct was to stay back. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't someone who rushed into dangerous situations, but something inside him urged him to move, to do something. He found himself running toward the car before he could stop himself. When he reached it, he saw the driver slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious but breathing. His face was bloody, and the windshield was shattered. James fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed 911. "There's been an accident," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "A car crash, right by Cedarville Park. The driver is unconscious. You need to send someone right away." The operator assured him that help was on the way, but as James hung up, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He looked around. The park, normally so serene, felt eerily quiet. He glanced into the back seat of the car, expecting to see the usual clutter one might find in a vehicle, grocery bags, maybe a jacket or a book. Instead, his eyes locked onto something unexpected, a large duffel bag. The zipper was partially open, revealing stacks of cash and what looked like files or documents. James's heart raced. This wasn't just an ordinary accident. Whoever this man was, he was carrying something valuable, something that wasn't meant to be seen by just anyone. James's mind whirled with questions. Who was this man? Why was he carrying so much money? And more importantly, why did this feel so wrong? He knew he should leave it alone. The police would be here soon, and they would deal with it. But something about the situation gnawed at him. He hesitated, his gaze darting between the unconscious man and the bag in the backseat. He reached into the car, just for a moment, just to take a quick look. His fingers brushed against one of the documents, and as he pulled it out slightly, he caught a glimpse of a name, one he recognized. It was a prominent figure in Cedarville, someone everyone in town trusted and respected. But why would that name be connected to this much cash and a car crash? The sound of sirens in the distance snapped James out of his thoughts. He quickly shoved the document back into the bag and stepped away from the car. He had seen too much. The paramedics arrived within minutes, tending to the injured driver, while the police began to secure the scene. James stood off to the side, watching as they worked, his mind racing. He had no idea what he had just stumbled upon, but he knew one thing for sure. His life was no longer as ordinary as it had been that morning. As the ambulance pulled away and the police started questioning witnesses, James couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. He was just an accountant. He wasn't supposed to get involved in things like this. But now he had a secret he wasn't sure he wanted to keep. He told the officers what he had seen, but left out the part about the duffel bag and the name on the document. He couldn't bring himself to reveal that part, at least not yet. Walking away from the scene, James felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, curiosity, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Whatever he had uncovered, it was bigger than him. He couldn't pretend it didn't exist. As he made his way back home, he realized that his quiet, predictable life had just been shattered, and there was no turning back. The ordinary man from Cedarville had found himself at the center of something extraordinary, and for the first time in his life, James wasn't sure what his next step should be. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, after returning from the accident scene, he sat in his living room, staring at the wall, his mind replaying everything that had happened. He thought about the duffel bag and its mysterious contents, the stacks of cash, the documents with names he recognized. He kept telling himself he should forget about it, leave it to the police, let them do their job. But deep down, he knew he couldn't just walk away from what he'd seen. The next day, James went to work as usual, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every conversation he had, every task he completed, felt distant and meaningless. His coworkers noticed that something was off, but when they asked if he was all right, James just smiled and nodded, brushing off their concern. How could he explain the unease that had settled over him, like a dark cloud following him wherever he went? At lunch, he found himself sitting alone in his car, staring at his phone. He knew the news of the accident would have spread around town by now. Cedarville was small, and nothing stayed a secret for long. He pulled up the local news app, scrolling through headlines about mundane town events, waiting to see if there was any mention of the crash. And then there it was: local man in critical condition after single car accident near Cedarville Park. The article didn't say much, just that the man had been rushed to the hospital and that the cause of the accident was still under investigation. James frowned. There was no mention of the bag, no mention of the cash, or the strange documents. He wondered if the police had found the bag and chosen to keep it quiet, or if they had somehow missed it altogether. The latter seemed unlikely, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden. He debated whether or not he should go to the police with what he knew, but the thought of getting involved in something so murky made his stomach churn. Later that afternoon, while James was finishing up some paperwork at his desk, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. Frowning, he opened it. The message was short, but it sent a chill down his spine. "We know what you took. Keep your mouth shut." James felt his heart skip a beat. His hand shook as he stared at the message, trying to process what it meant. Had someone seen him at the scene of the accident? Was someone watching him now? He glanced around his office, feeling suddenly exposed. His palms were sweaty, and he felt the walls closing in around him. This wasn't supposed to happen. James was just an ordinary guy. He wasn't supposed to be in the middle of something like this. He hadn't even taken anything from the crash, except for that brief moment when he looked at the documents. But apparently, that had been enough to catch someone's attention. For the rest of the day, James couldn't focus. His mind raced with possibilities. Who had sent the message? How had they gotten his number? And what exactly did they think he had taken? His first instinct was to delete the message and pretend it had never happened, but that nagging feeling of dread wouldn't let him do that. He knew now that he was in the middle of something far bigger than he had realized. By the time James got home that evening, the weight of it all was crushing him. He felt like a man on the edge of a cliff, teetering between safety and a free fall into the unknown. He paced around his living room, replaying the events of the crash over and over in his mind, trying to figure out what to do. Should he go to the police? Should he tell someone what had happened? But as he thought about it, his paranoia grew. What if the people behind that text were connected to the police? What if he couldn't trust anyone in Cedarville? The town had always seemed so quiet, so innocent, but now James wasn't sure what to believe. If someone was willing to send him a threatening message, there was no telling how deep this went. That night, James barely slept. Every noise outside his window made him jump, and his mind raced with possibilities. What if someone was watching him? What if they were waiting for him to make a mistake? He tried to tell himself that he was overreacting, that this was just some kind of scare tactic, but deep down he knew it was more than that. Whoever had sent that message was serious. The next morning, James woke up feeling more exhausted than he had the night before. His body was sore from the tension, his mind clouded by the lack of sleep. He stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering how his life had spiraled so quickly out of control. Just 2 days ago, he had been a normal guy in a normal town, going through the motions of a normal life. Now, he felt like a stranger in his own skin, haunted by secrets and fears he didn't fully understand. He thought about calling in sick to work, but he knew that wouldn't help. Staying home wouldn't make the problem go away. In fact, it might only make things worse. He needed to keep moving, keep pretending like everything was normal, even though nothing felt normal anymore. As he walked to his car, he noticed something strange. There was a small piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. His heart sank as he pulled it out and unfolded it. The message was simple, but it was enough to send a fresh wave of fear through him. "Don't make us ask again." James felt a shiver run down his spine. He looked around, scanning the street for any sign of who might have left the note, but there was no one. The street was empty, just as it always was in the early morning. He crumpled the paper in his hand, feeling the weight of it like a lead ball in his chest. They were watching him. Whoever they were watching, and they weren't going to go away. He sat in his car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel and trying to calm his racing thoughts. What had he gotten himself into? He thought back to the crash, to the moment he had opened that duffel bag. It had only been for a second, but that second had changed everything. He wished he could go back in time and undo it, pretend he had never seen what was inside, but it was too late for that now. James knew he couldn't ignore the situation any longer. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. He needed to figure out who they were, and fast. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, someone he could trust, someone who could help him make sense of this mess. But in a town like Cedarville, who could he turn to? As he drove to work, his mind raced with possibilities. He considered going to the police, but the fear of corruption gnawed at him. He didn't know who was involved or how far this went. Then he thought about his old friend, Patrick, who had moved to Cedarville years ago after working in law enforcement in the city. Patrick was tough, resourceful, and more importantly, he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty when it came to finding the truth. Maybe, just maybe, Patrick could help him figure out what was really going on. That evening, James met Patrick at a quiet bar on the edge of town, far away from prying eyes. As they sat in a corner booth, James told him everything: the crash, the duffel bag, the documents, and the threatening messages. Patrick listened quietly, his face a mask of concentration. When James was finished, Patrick sat back, exhaling slowly. "You've stepped into something big, James," he said, his voice low. "This isn't just some random accident. Whoever these people are, they don't mess around." James swallowed hard, his worst fears confirmed. "What do I do?" Patrick leaned forward, his eyes dark with intensity. "We figure out who's behind this before they make their next move. But you need to be careful, James. These people, they won't hesitate to make you disappear if they think you're a threat." James felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his chest. He had hoped Patrick would have answers, but instead, he felt even more lost than before. But one thing was clear: there was no turning back now. He was in too deep, and the only way out was to uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous that might be. As they left the bar, Patrick promised to dig into the accident and see what he could find out about the man involved. But as James drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The shadows seemed longer, the streets quieter. He knew he had to act fast. Something bigger was lurking beneath the surface of Sitterville, and James had unknowingly stumbled right into the middle of it. James couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that had settled over him like a heavy fog. The days that followed his meeting with Patrick felt surreal, each one more disjointed than the last. Patrick had promised to dig into the accident, to find out more about the man in the crash and the mysterious duffel bag. But days turned into a week, and James hadn't heard from him. The silence was maddening, leaving James to wrestle with his thoughts alone. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart skipped a beat, thinking it might be Patrick with some kind of news. But more often than not, it was just a notification from work or a spam message. The text that had threatened him still weighed heavily on his mind. He tried to go about his routine, hoping to find some sense of normalcy, but it was impossible. The quiet streets of Sitterville felt ominous now, and the once comforting predictability of his life had been shattered. He had no idea who was watching him or what they wanted, and the not knowing was what scared him the most. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk at work, staring blankly at his computer screen, his phone buzzed again. He almost didn't check it, assuming it was another pointless message, but something urged him to look. This time, it wasn't a spam message or a work email. It was from Patrick. "Meet me tonight. The Old Mill, 9 p.m. Come alone." James's stomach flipped as he read the message. The Old Mill. It was on the outskirts of Sitterville, an abandoned building that had been shut down years ago. Why would Patrick want to meet there? And why so late? His mind raced with questions, but he knew better than to push back. Patrick had been in law enforcement long enough to know when discretion was necessary. If he said to meet there, alone, there was a reason for it. The hours crawled by slowly after that. James tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting to the mill, to what Patrick might have found. He glanced at the clock every few minutes, feeling the anticipation build in his chest. When 8 p.m. finally rolled around, James left the office and drove home, his mind racing with possibilities. By the time he pulled up to the mill, the sun had already set, and the area was bathed in darkness. The old mill was a hulking shadow on the landscape, its windows long since shattered, its walls covered in graffiti. It had once been the heart of Sitterville's industrial era, but now it was little more than a decaying monument to a bygone time. James parked his car a short distance away, glancing around nervously as he got out. The gravel crunched under his feet as he approached the building, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. He didn't like this. Not one bit. The place felt wrong. Too quiet, too isolated. But Patrick had asked him to come, and James trusted him. As he neared the entrance, he saw Patrick's car parked off to the side. That eased his nerves a bit, At least Patrick was already here. He stepped inside the mill, the old wooden floorboards creaking under his weight. The air was musty, thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew. The faint glow of a flashlight flickered deeper inside the building, and James followed it, his heart pounding. "Patrick," James called softly as he moved further into the darkened space. He heard movement up ahead and quickened his pace. When he found Patrick, the former cop was standing near a large rusted piece of machinery, his face illuminated by the beam of the flashlight. But something was off. Patrick's expression was grim, his jaw set tight. There was no friendly greeting, no acknowledgement of the old times they had shared. Just a cold, serious demeanor. "What's going on?" James asked, his voice low. "What did you find out?" Patrick glanced around as if to make sure they were truly alone before he spoke. "This goes deeper than we thought, James. The man in that car accident. He wasn't just some unlucky guy. He was part of a network, a criminal network that's been operating out of Cedarville for years." James felt his blood run cold. A criminal network? In Cedarville? How is that possible? Patrick sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's bigger than just this town. Cedarville is just one of many stops for them. They'd been using the town as a front, laundering money, moving drugs, and worse. That crash you witnessed, it wasn't an accident. The guy was running, and he lost control of the car. And the duffel bag you saw, that money was part of a major deal. Whoever sent you that text, whoever is watching you, they think you know more than you do. They're scared, and they're getting desperate." James's heart pounded in his chest as Patrick's words sank in. "So what do we do?" "I didn't ask for any of this, Patrick. I just want it to go away." "I know," Patrick said, his tone softening. "But you're involved now, whether you like it or not. They think you're a threat, and that means they won't stop until they're sure you're not going to talk. We need to figure out who's behind this and take them down, or you'll never be safe." James felt a wave of panic wash over him. "Take them down? How?" "I'm not a cop, Patrick. I don't know anything about this kind of stuff." Patrick reached into his jacket and pulled out a small USB drive. "You don't have to be a cop. I've been digging around, and I found some files. Financial records, communications, proof that connects some of the biggest players in this network. But it's not enough. We need more. I need you to keep an eye on things, watch for anything suspicious. If we can gather enough evidence, we can take this to the authorities." James stared at the USB drive, feeling a mix of fear and confusion. "You want me to spy on them? Patrick, I don't even know who they are. How am I supposed to do that?" Patrick leaned in, his eyes intense. "I'm not asking you to take any crazy risks. Just keep your head down, stay alert. If anything feels off, let me know. And don't talk to anyone about this, not even your closest friends. The people involved in this are powerful, and they have eyes everywhere." James felt his throat tighten. He had never asked to be a part of something like this, and now it felt like he was in way over his head. But what choice did he have? He couldn't go to the police. He couldn't just pretend none of this was happening. If he did, he'd be living in fear for the rest of his life. "Okay," James finally said, his voice shaky. "I'll help, but you have to promise me something." "What's that?" Patrick asked. "You have to get me out of this, Patrick. When this is over, I want my life back. No more secrets, no more threats. Just normal." Patrick nodded solemnly. "I'll do everything I can, James, but you need to be careful. This isn't just some small-time operation. We're talking about people who will do whatever it takes to protect their interests. You need to stay smart, stay safe." James swallowed hard, his mind spinning with everything Patrick had told him. He didn't know how he had gone from an ordinary accountant in a quiet town to being wrapped up in something so dangerous. But one thing was clear: his life would never be the same again. As they left the mill and James drove home, The darkness outside seemed to press in on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that every shadow, every passing car, could be someone watching him, waiting for him to slip up. He tried to reassure himself that Patrick would protect him, that they would find a way to bring these criminals down. But deep down, James knew that the road ahead was going to be long, dangerous, and full of uncertainty. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, James couldn't help but wonder how much more there was to this story. If what Patrick had said was true, the network they were up against wasn't just confined to Cedarville. It stretched far beyond, into places James could hardly imagine. And if they were willing to go this far to silence him, what else were they capable of? James had always been a man of routine, of quiet, predictable days. But now his world had been turned upside down, and the person he had been before the crash seemed like a distant memory. As he drifted off to sleep, one thought echoed in his mind. What have I gotten myself into? The following few days passed in a haze for James. Every step he took seemed weighted. Every glance over his shoulder felt like someone was watching him. Someone waiting for him to slip up. His normal life, the one filled with spreadsheets, numbers, and quiet routines, was slipping further and further away. It had been replaced by a constant, gnawing paranoia. He couldn't escape the feeling that his every move was being monitored, that at any moment the people behind the accident would come knocking. Patrick's words about the criminal network stuck in his mind like a thorn he couldn't pull out. Cedarville, a place he had always thought of as boring, safe, and insulated from the bigger issues of the world, was now a part of something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The thought of being involved in something so dangerous had once seemed absurd, but now it was his reality. One night, James found himself standing at his window, staring out at the quiet street below. The neighborhood was still, just as it had always been. The street lamps cast long shadows over the empty road, and the occasional car passed by without incident. But James felt no peace. It was as if the quiet was taunting him, masking the danger that lurked beneath the surface. His thoughts wandered back to the man in the car accident, to the brief moment when he had opened that duffel bag and seen the money, the documents. He had no idea who that man really was, and now it seemed that knowing too much was exactly what had gotten him into this mess. Suddenly, his phone buzzed, breaking the stillness of the room. James flinched, his heart racing as he reached for it. It was another text from Patrick. "We need to meet. Urgent. Usual place. Midnight." James's pulse quickened. It had been days since he had heard from Patrick, and now this cryptic message felt like a signal that things were escalating. Midnight. The usual place. He knew that meant the old mill, the same eerie, abandoned building where they had met the last time. James's gut twisted. He didn't like the idea of going back there, especially not in the dead of night. But Patrick wouldn't have asked if it wasn't important. He grabbed his coat and car keys, slipping out of the house as quietly as possible. As he drove toward the mill, the roads were nearly empty, the town asleep under a blanket of darkness. The mill loomed in the distance like a hulking, forgotten relic. It had always creeped James out as a kid, and now, knowing what he knew about the criminal activity happening in Cedarville, it felt even more menacing. James parked a short distance away, just as he had before, and walked the rest of the way to the mill. His footsteps echoed softly in the still night air, and his breath came in quick, shallow bursts. He hated how jumpy he felt, how out of control everything had become. All he wanted was his old life back, the one that didn't involve hidden criminals or clandestine meetings at midnight. As he approached the entrance to the mill, he saw Patrick standing near the same rusted machinery where they had spoken last time. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, casting long shadows that made the place feel even more ominous. "Patrick," James called out quietly as he neared. Patrick turned to face him, but something in his expression made James pause. There was tension in his posture, a tightness in his jaw that hadn't been there before. His eyes darted around, as if he was expecting someone, or something. else to show up. "James, we're running out of time," Patrick said, his voice low but urgent. "Things are moving fast, faster than I expected. I thought we had more time, but I was wrong." "What do you mean?" James asked, his stomach twisting into knots. "What's happening?" Patrick rubbed a hand over his face, the strain of the past few days clearly showing. "That network I told you about. They're onto us. They know we're looking into them, and they're getting desperate. I've been following a few leads, but they've been covering their tracks. Whoever is running this thing, they've got power, resources. This isn't just a small-town operation. It's bigger than I thought." James felt the floor drop out from under him. "What do you mean they know? Are we in danger?" Patrick nodded grimly. "Yeah, we're in deep, James. I've been trying to keep a low profile, but I think they've started watching me. And if they're watching me, it's only a matter of time before they come after you." James's mind raced. The idea that someone could be watching Patrick, and by extension, him, made his blood run cold. "What are we supposed to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Patrick hesitated, glancing around the mill as if he were weighing his options. "I've been working on gathering more evidence," he said finally. "But I need you to be careful. They don't know how much we know. But if they get even a hint that we're onto them, they'll make their move. I think they're already starting to clean up loose ends." "What do you mean by loose ends?" James asked, dread pooling in his stomach. Patrick's face darkened. "People involved with this network are disappearing. Quietly. A few low-level guys, some associates. They're being erased. I don't know if they're being paid off, or if something worse is happening, but they're going dark. That's why we need to be cautious." James felt his pulse quicken. This was more than he had ever bargained for. He had thought this was just about some money laundering, maybe a small-town crime ring. But now, hearing Patrick talk about people disappearing, he realized how dangerous this had become. This wasn't just about Sitterville anymore. This was something much bigger, much more dangerous. "So what's the plan?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Patrick glanced around one more time before lowering his voice. "There's someone I know, someone outside the usual channels. He's not local, but he's been tracking this network for a while. I think he might have some information that can help us. I'm meeting with him tomorrow night." James nodded, trying to absorb everything Patrick was saying. "And what do you need me to do?" Patrick gave him a hard look. "Lay low. Keep your eyes open, but don't draw attention to yourself. If anything feels off, if you see anything suspicious, you call me immediately. We can't afford any mistakes right now. They're watching, James, and if they catch wind of what we're doing, it's game over." James swallowed hard. The weight of Patrick's words settled heavy on his chest. He nodded, knowing that there was no turning back now. Whatever was happening, whatever was coming, he was in the thick of it. He just hoped that he and Patrick could stay ahead of whoever was pulling the strings. As they left the mill and James drove home, his thoughts churned. The darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. James couldn't shake the feeling that everything was teetering on the edge of disaster, that at any moment, everything could come crashing down. When he got home, he didn't even bother trying to sleep. Instead, he sat in his living room, staring out the window, his mind racing with everything Patrick had told him. People disappearing. The network closing in. It was too much. He felt trapped, like he was caught in a web of lies and danger that he couldn't escape. And then, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, James's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't from Patrick. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, he opened the message. "You're running out of time. We know who you are, and we're coming." James stared at the message, his heart hammering in his chest. They had found him. And now, there was no telling what would happen next. He was no longer just a witness to something dark. Now, he was a target. The morning after James received the ominous text message, the world seemed to move in slow motion around him. The threat in that message, "We know who you are, and we're coming," played on a loop in his mind, its sinister weight settling into his bones. Everything in his life felt surreal, like he was living in someone else's nightmare. Every time he glanced at his phone, he expected to see another message, another warning. He jumped at the sound of passing cars, half expecting someone to jump out and drag him into the shadows. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was coming, it wasn't just an empty threat. The people behind the network were closing in, and they had their eyes on him. Patrick's warning about how dangerous this network was, and how high up their connections went, echoed in his mind. People were disappearing, and if James wasn't careful, he would be next. By mid-morning, James's paranoia had reached a boiling point. He kept checking his front windows, expecting to see unmarked cars lurking outside or strangers sitting on the curb, watching him. But Cedarville remained unnervingly quiet. The peaceful town he had known for so long seemed to mock him with its calm, as if it had turned its back on him when he needed it most. He needed answers. More than that, he needed a plan. He couldn't just sit around and wait for them to come after him. With a deep breath, James grabbed his phone and dialed Patrick's number, hoping for some clarity, some reassurance that there was still a way out of this mess. But the phone rang and rang without an answer, going to voicemail. Panic surged through him. "Patrick, it's me. Call me back as soon as you get this. I got another message. They know who I am. We need to talk." He hung up and paced around his living room, trying to make sense of his next move. Maybe Patrick was busy, or maybe he was laying low, but that didn't calm James's growing anxiety. The thought that Patrick might have been compromised, or worse, began to creep into his mind. Without Patrick's guidance, James felt more lost than ever. Desperate for any sense of direction, James began sifting through the fragmented pieces of the puzzle he had gathered over the past few weeks. The duffel bag full of cash and documents, the names in those files, prominent members of Cedarville's elite. He remembered that one name in particular had stood out to him: Arnold Blackwell. Blackwell was a well-respected businessman in town, the kind of man who hosted charity events and served on the town council. His public image was spotless, but James knew that people like Blackwell often had secrets buried deep beneath their polished facades. Could Blackwell be involved in the network Patrick was talking about? Was he one of the shadowy figures pulling the strings? It seemed unlikely, but James couldn't shake the feeling that Blackwell's name appearing in those documents wasn't a coincidence. With no other leads to follow, James made a decision. If Blackwell was involved, maybe confronting him could shed some light on the situation. Maybe James could get answers about what was really going on, and more importantly, how to get himself out of it. It was a long shot, but James was out of options. He spent the next few hours tracking down information about Arnold Blackwell. Cedarville wasn't a big town, and it didn't take long to find out where Blackwell lived. His estate was on the outskirts of town, a sprawling property that sat behind tall iron gates. James had driven past it once or twice before, but he had never given it much thought. Now, it felt like the epicenter of everything wrong in his life. James spent the rest of the day psyching himself up, mentally preparing for what he knew was a dangerous gamble. As the sun set, casting long shadows over Cedarville, James felt the weight of what he was about to do. Confronting a man like Blackwell was risky. Blackwell had power, connections, and if he really was involved in the criminal network, he wouldn't hesitate to make James disappear. Still, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was his only chance. If he stayed silent, if he waited for the network to make their move, he would be a sitting duck. He had to be proactive, even if it meant walking into the lion's den. That evening, just as darkness fell over Cedarville, James made his way to Blackwell's estate. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he drove, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he was taking a massive risk, but the alternative, waiting for the inevitable, was too terrifying to consider. When he reached the iron gates of Blackwell's estate, James hesitated. He could still turn back. He could still abandon this reckless plan and try to disappear, leave Cedarville behind, and hope the network would forget about him. But deep down, he knew that wasn't an option. Running would only delay the inevitable. The only way out was through. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, James pressed the intercom button at the gate. "Who is it?" A voice crackled through the speaker, cold and indifferent. "It's James O'Connell," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to speak to Mr. Blackwell. It's urgent." There was a long pause, and for a moment, James feared they would turn him away. But then, with a metallic click, the gates began to swing open. James drove up the long, winding driveway, his heart racing with every inch closer he got to the house. Blackwell's estate was even more imposing up close, a grand mansion that loomed over the landscape, its tall windows glowing with soft light. As James parked and got out of his car, he took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. A butler met him at the door, leading him through the grand entrance and into a sitting room that looked like something out of a museum. Ornate furniture, expensive paintings, and an air of quiet luxury. James couldn't help but feel out of place. He didn't belong here, and he certainly didn't belong in the world of men like Arnold Blackwell. After what felt like an eternity, Blackwell finally appeared. He was a tall man with silver hair, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. His expression was calm, almost disinterested, as he entered the room and regarded James with a cold, calculating gaze. "Mr. O'Connell," Blackwell said smoothly, taking a seat across from James. "I understand you wish to speak with me. To what do I owe the pleasure?" James swallowed hard, trying to gather his thoughts. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. But now that he was here, face to face with Blackwell, he knew he couldn't back down. "I know about the crash," James said, his voice trembling slightly. "I know about the money, the documents. I saw your name in them, Blackwell. I know you're involved in something big." For a moment, Blackwell said nothing, his eyes narrowing as he studied James. The silence in the room was suffocating. Then, slowly, Blackwell leaned forward, his lips curling into a thin, humorless smile. "You've gotten yourself into quite a predicament, haven't you, Mr. O'Connell?" James's pulse quickened. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want any part of it. But now I'm involved. And I need answers." Blackwell's smile widened, though there was no warmth in it. "You've stumbled onto something far beyond your understanding. The network you speak of, it's not just a small-town operation. It's, shall we say, a necessary part of the world we live in. People like me, we ensure things run smoothly. Sometimes that means getting our hands dirty." James felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "And what happens to people like me? People who see too much?" Blackwell's expression hardened. "People like you, they usually disappear." James's heart sank. He had known, deep down, that this was a possibility, but hearing Blackwell say it so casually made it all the more terrifying. But Blackwell continued, his tone almost amused. "You've shown a certain resourcefulness. I could use someone like you, someone who knows when to keep their mouth shut." James stared at Blackwell, his mind racing. Was this an offer? A way out? "I'm not like you," James said, his voice shaking. "I don't want any part of this." Blackwell shrugged, standing up from his seat. "You may not have a choice, Mr. O'Connell. You're in this now, whether you like it or not." Before James could respond, Blackwell turned to leave. "Think it over, James. You've got a decision to make. But choose wisely, your life may depend on it." As the butler escorted him back to his car, James felt a chill settle deep in his bones. The choice Blackwell had offered him wasn't a real choice at all. He was trapped, caught in a web of power and corruption far bigger than he had ever imagined. And now, the only question that remained was, how much longer could he survive? Driving away from Blackwell's estate, James knew one thing for certain. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. James drove away from Arnold Blackwell's estate with a cold sense of dread settling in his chest. The man's words echoed in his mind, each syllable punctuating the terrifying reality that James had now fully grasped. He wasn't just a bystander who had stumbled upon something dangerous. He was caught in the web, and there was no easy escape. The offer Blackwell had made was no offer at all. It was a threat wrapped in a veneer of civility. Either James played along, or he would disappear like the others. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. Could he run, leave Cedarville behind, and start a new life somewhere else? But as soon as the thought crossed his mind, he realized how futile it was. Men like Blackwell had resources, connections. They could find him no matter where he went. Running wasn't an option. James barely slept that night, his thoughts consumed by the impossible situation he found himself in. Every sound outside his window made him jump. Every creak of the house felt like a warning that time was running out. The next morning, he was no closer to finding a solution than he had been the night before. But one thing was clear. He couldn't go to the police. Blackwell's reach likely extended to the local authorities. Patrick had hinted at it. And now, after the chilling encounter at the estate, James believed it more than ever. He was on his own. The day passed in a blur, with James going through the motions of work, pretending everything was normal while his mind remained fixated on his situation. He kept glancing at his phone, half expecting another message from Blackwell or worse, someone following up on the earlier threats. But by late afternoon, there had been nothing. No texts, no strange calls, no sign of anyone watching him. It was as if the calm before a storm had settled over him. And that was almost worse than constant pressure. The waiting, the not knowing, it gnawed at him. Later that evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, his phone buzzed. It wasn't a message this time, but a call from Patrick. Relief surged through him, but also a fresh wave of anxiety. He answered immediately. "Patrick, thank God. I was starting to think." "James," Patrick interrupted, his voice low and urgent. "We need to talk now. Meet me at the spot." James's heart sank. He knew what Patrick meant. The old mill. They'd met there before, but now the thought of returning filled him with unease. Still, he had no choice. He agreed to meet and quickly grabbed his coat, heading out the door. The drive to the mill felt longer than it had before. The roads, bathed in twilight, seemed emptier, more desolate. As James pulled up to the mill's entrance, the hulking silhouette of the abandoned building loomed over him like a dark omen. He parked his car and stepped out into the cold night air. The wind whipped through the trees, rustling the branches in a way that made James's skin crawl. Patrick was already inside, waiting near the rusted machinery where they had met before, but something about his posture seemed off. He wasn't standing in his usual confident, calm manner. He was pacing, rubbing the back of his neck, a nervous energy radiating from him. As James approached, Patrick looked up, his face itched with worry. "What's going on?" James asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "What did you find out?" Patrick stopped pacing and looked James square in the eye. "We're in deeper than I thought, James. I've been digging around, following some leads, and I've found out who's behind all of this. The network, the money, the disappearances. It all leads back to one person. Blackwell." James's stomach dropped. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed out loud made it all the more real. "Blackwell's the one running everything?" James asked, his voice barely a whisper. James drove away from Arnold Blackwell's estate with a cold sense of dread settling in his chest. The man's words echoed in his mind, each syllable punctuating the terrifying reality that James had now fully grasped. He wasn't just a bystander who had stumbled upon something dangerous. He was caught in the web, and there was no easy escape. The offer Blackwell had made was no offer at all. It was a threat wrapped in a veneer of civility. Either James played along, or he would disappear like the others. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. Could he run? Leave Cedarville behind and start a new life somewhere else? But as soon as the thought crossed his mind, he realized how futile it was. Men like Blackwell had resources, connections. They could find him no matter where he went. Running wasn't an option. James barely slept that night, his thoughts consumed by the impossible situation he found himself in. Every sound outside his window made him jump. Every creak of the house felt like a warning that time was running out. The next morning, he was no closer to finding a solution than he had been the night before. But one thing was clear. He couldn't go to the police. Blackwell's reach likely extended to the local authorities. Patrick had hinted at it. And now, after the chilling encounter at the estate, James believed it more than ever. He was on his own. The day passed in a blur, with James going through the motions of work, pretending everything was normal while his mind remained fixated on his situation. He kept glancing at his phone, half expecting another message from Blackwell or worse, someone following up on the earlier threats. But by late afternoon, there had been nothing. No texts, no strange calls, no sign of anyone watching him. It was as if the calm before a storm had settled over him. And that was almost worse than constant pressure. The waiting, the not knowing, it gnawed at him. Later that evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, his phone buzzed. It wasn't a message this time, but a call from Patrick. Relief surged through him, but also a fresh wave of anxiety. He answered immediately. "Patrick, thank God. I was starting to think." "James," Patrick interrupted, his voice low and urgent. "We need to talk now. Meet me at the spot." James's heart sank. He knew what Patrick meant. The old mill. They'd met there before, but now the thought of returning filled him with unease. Still, he had no choice. He agreed to meet and quickly grabbed his coat, heading out the door. The drive to the mill felt longer than it had before. The roads, bathed in twilight, seemed emptier, more desolate. As James pulled up to the mill's entrance, the hulking silhouette of the abandoned building loomed over him like a dark omen. He parked his car and stepped out into the cold night air. The wind whipped through the trees, rustling the branches in a way that made James's skin crawl. Patrick was already inside, waiting near the rusted machinery where they had met before, but something about his posture seemed off. He wasn't standing in his usual confident, calm manner. He was pacing, rubbing the back of his neck, a nervous energy radiating from him. As James approached, Patrick looked up, his face etched with worry. "What's going on?" James asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "What did you find out?" Patrick stopped pacing and looked James square in the eye. "We're in deeper than I thought, James. I've been digging around, following some leads, and I've found out who's behind all of this. The network, the money, the disappearances. It all leads back to one person. Blackwell." James's stomach dropped. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed out loud made it all the more real. "Blackwell's the one running everything?" James asked, his voice barely a whisper. Patrick nodded. "He's the kingpin. Everything that's been happening in Cedarville, the drugs, the money laundering, the people disappearing. It all traces back to him. But it's not just Cedarville. He's got operations in other towns, other cities. Cedarville is just one piece of a much larger puzzle." James felt his breath catch in his throat. The enormity of the situation was overwhelming. This wasn't just a local crime ring. This was something bigger, something far-reaching, and he had stumbled into the middle of it. "What do we do?" James asked, feeling a sense of hopelessness wash over him. Patrick's expression darkened. "We don't have many options. Blackwell has too many connections, too much power. The police won't help, not when half of them are probably on his payroll. I've been trying to reach out to people I know outside of town, people who might be able to help, but even they're hesitant to get involved." James's mind raced. "So what does that mean? Are we just supposed to wait around until they come for us?" Patrick shook his head. "No. There's one last play we can make, but it's risky. I've got enough evidence now. Emails, financial records, documents that could bring Blackwell down. But it's not enough to just hand it over to the authorities. We need to go public. We need to blow this thing wide open. James stared at Patrick, his heart pounding. Go public? How? Even if we do, what's stopping Blackwell from coming after us? Patrick's jaw tightened. Once the information is out there, it'll be harder for him to make us disappear without drawing attention. If we can get this story into the right hands, if we can expose him on a national level, Blackwell won't be able to cover it up. But we have to act fast. He knows we're onto him, and he's not going to wait much longer before he makes his move. James's mind was spinning. The idea of going public, of turning this entire nightmare into a media firestorm, terrified him. But Patrick was right. It was their only option. They couldn't keep hiding, hoping Blackwell wouldn't come for them. They had to go on the offensive. How do we do it? James asked, his voice steadying with resolve. Patrick pulled a USB drive from his pocket. This has everything we need. Emails, financial records, proof of Blackwell's involvement in the network. I've already reached out to a contact in the media, someone I trust. If we can get this into the right hands, it'll blow the lid off the whole operation. James took the USB drive from Patrick, the weight of it heavy in his hand. It felt like holding a grenade, knowing that one wrong move could set off an explosion that would change everything. I'm meeting with the contact tomorrow night, Patrick continued. But until then, you need to lay low. Keep this safe. If anything happens to me, you take it and run. Do you understand? James nodded, though the gravity of what he was agreeing to felt like it was crushing him. What about you? Won't they come after you? Patrick smiled grimly. They'll try. But I've dealt with people like Blackwell before. I know how to handle myself. James wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that they had a chance of coming out of this alive. But the nagging fear in the back of his mind wouldn't go away. He had seen what Blackwell was capable of. If Patrick was right, if Blackwell truly was the mastermind behind all of this, they were up against more than just a criminal network. They were up against a man who controlled an empire. As James left the mill that night, the USB drive tucked safely in his pocket, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. The stakes had never been higher, and one wrong move could mean the end of everything. He drove home in silence, his thoughts consumed by the weight of what he was about to do. The next day, James couldn't focus. Every sound, every passing car outside his window, felt like a threat. He spent the day pacing, waiting for the call from Patrick that would signal the start of their plan. But as the hours dragged on, that call never came. By evening, James's anxiety had reached a breaking point. He tried calling Patrick, but there was no answer. He sent a text, no response. Panic began to set in. Something was wrong. He knew it. Without thinking, James grabbed his keys and drove to Patrick's house. As he pulled up to the driveway, his heart sank. The front door was wide open, and the house was dark. James got out of the car, his pulse racing. He approached the house slowly, his hand shaking as he pushed the door open further. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. No sign of Patrick, no sign of a struggle. But something felt wrong. James's eyes darted around the room, and that's when he saw it. A note, pinned to the wall with a knife. You should have listened. James's blood ran cold. He backed out of the house, his mind reeling. Patrick was gone, and now James was on his own. The realization hit him like a freight train. Blackwell had made his move, and now it was up to James to finish what they had started. The USB drive in his pocket felt like a ticking time bomb, the only thing standing between him and the darkness that was closing in. As James drove away from Patrick's house, his heart pounding in his chest, he knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over, but he